Where we stopped on Tuesday in chapter 8, we've been talking about virtue ethics. We're talking about virtue ethics, and we started out talking about Pat Tillman, and we talked about the ethics, whether or not you agreed that we have a deficiency of ethics in our society. Now, virtues, according to our author, the focus on virtue takes a different approach to morality. Remember when we've been talking about all kinds of morality, it's been talking about what we ought to do, those kinds of things. But rather asking what we ought to do, virtue asks how we ought to be. That is the very difference between virtue ethics and any other of the ethics that we have studied so far. Instead of asking what we ought to do, virtue ethics asks the questions, what we ought to be. That is the very difference of it. Not what you should do in terms of a measurement, like Kant has in terms of a maximum of tests that's appropriate to that, not what we ought to do according to what utilitarians say, that the maximum happiness for the maximum amount of people, not what we ought to do in terms of ethical relativism, you ought to do this and I ought to do that, you do you and I'll do me, not according to even egoism or psychological egoism, where we do those things that are the best things for us. But what we ought to be is a part of the virtue ethics. So when we're talking about what we ought to be, we're talking about this virtue ethics that is concerned with the traits of our character. It's all about our character. It's about the habits that we have, our tendencies, and our dispositions that make a good person. Because virtue ethics really concentrates on the character of people, and our character will determine what kind of habits that we, have in our lives, and what kind of tendencies that we have, and our personality in terms of our dispositions that make a person good, according to virtue ethics. And one version of ethics is focused on the thinking about saints and heroes as paradigms of exemplars of human excellence. So again, when you think about virtue, you think about in both I think it's the Quran as well as the Bible, you talk about what a woman and what makes a virtuous woman. And these are the characters, and these are the habits, and these are the tendencies and the dispositions that you see in that text. I believe it's Proverbs 31 in the Bible. And so it talks about, who would know a virtuous woman? And then he begins to describe her character, her habits, her tendencies, dispositions that makes this woman good. And so one of the versions that virtue ethics focuses on is this idea that there are saints and there are heroes also as paradigms or exemplars of this human excellence. That's what they're talking about when you're talking about virtue ethics. So now as we go into virtue ethics, the philosopher Susan Wolf, this is one of the people that you have to remember, much like you would remember Mill, or you would remember Kant, or you would remember Bethan, or you would remember Peter Singer, or any of those. Susan Wolf describes a moral saint as a person whose action is as good as possible, those who is as morally worthy as can be. But Wolf would go on to argue that moral saints are not especially happy These are not especially happy people, since the demands on saintly perfection might include self-sacrifice. So to go through that again, in moral sainthood, according to Susan Wolf, that person, every action is as good as possible. They have a moral worthiness. But she argues that moral saints are not happy people because they have to always be self-sacrificial, which means that they're not ever looking after themselves. They can't ever pursue their happiness if they're considered a moral saint, because everything demands of them in saintly perfection to be self-sacrificial. Does that make sense to you so far from your reading and what we're talking about today?
Yeah, I got it somewhat.
Okay. Virtue ethics tends to hold that happiness is something different from pleasure. It's different from pleasure. Pleasure in virtue ethics does not necessarily mean happiness, as we defined it with utilitarianism, or even as Kant would say it. Pleasure is what a person in virtue ethics might do for someone else. It's more self-sacrificial. It is not about my own happiness. It is not derived by making someone else happy, but it is the pleasure of service. So, a moral saint, according to Wolf, and according to many those who are philosophers in the area of virtue ethics, would say a moral saint would not be cruel. Yes, Dominique.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
My question was on the other part when you were saying, well, I might have missed a few things, so just so I have some clarity here. You were saying, like, it's not, I guess, what makes you feel good or whatever. So I guess my example was like, say somebody needs to borrow money, right? And like maybe you might not like to do it, but you have it and you care about that person, so you like do it because you know that they need it. It's not necessarily something that makes you feel good, but it's like the almost like what you needed to do kind of for like that person. Is that right? Or am I not understanding?
Well, let me go back a little bit for you. And so hopefully this will make more sense. So I know that you came in a little later, so let me take back here. So virtues, as opposed to what we ought to do, which is kind of what you're describing, does not describe what we ought to do. It more describes what we ought to be, the types of persons that we ought to be. Moral ethics does not say to you and I what you ought to do in life, how you, as utilitarians would say, you need to, create the greatest happiness for the greatest amount of people. It would not say, like Kant would say, that we need to focus, in this other way. It is saying that you ought to be these things. You need to be concerned with your traits of your own character. So these are things that are inward rather than outward. Your character, your habits, your tendencies, and your disposition that makes a person good. So with virtue ethics, it is talking about what you ought to be. Your character should be exemplary. Your habits should reflect that character. The tendencies should reflect that character. Your disposition should reflect that character. And if all of that is lining up, this is what makes that person good, what you ought to be. So in other words, what I ought to be in the case that I think you were talking about, Dominique, is what I ought to be would be a generous person. Okay, so if my character is generosity, then it would not be anything within me to not loan someone that money, because it would be a part of my habit, it would be a part of my tendency, and it would be a part of my disposition. If I was a patient person in terms of the character and the virtue that's within me, then I am going to tend not in my habits, not to go from 0 to 60, when someone upsets me. My tendencies would be to be more tempered in my responses in life, and my disposition would be more settled. Does that make more sense? Yes, Dominique.
Okay, so I guess that then in turn, why, okay, so if it's like who you're supposed to be, why was that guy Tillman considered the like virtue ethics example? Because who's to say like, well, I feel like he did what he did because it made him feel good, and also because like he wanted to, like help the country. But it wasn't like what he had to do or what he ought to do, I don't think. Or did I miss?
And that's correct. It wasn't what he ought to do, because remember the difference between virtue
Well,
and
how we ought to do is this one.
how we
Oh, how we ought to be.
ought to be. It's
So
not
they're saying that that's what we should do. We should be the sacrificial lamb.
no, how we ought to be should be whatever the character that is in us that makes us good. The author uses Pat Tillman as an example of how people consider virtue, but it's not necessarily, that's why we're talking through this. It's not necessarily a virtue to everyone, because virtue is concerned with the traits of character, habits, tendencies, and dispositions that makes a person good. But what we ought to be is different for different people.
Right.
And so what he ought to be at that point for him was he was loyal to his country more than he was to his career. And so that loyalty trait became one of the virtues of his character, the loyalty to leave a lucrative football career to go and fight a war that he felt that it was loyal to his country to fight. His habit started from saying, I'm going to leave this career that does not have the loyalty to this country at this time. I'm going to go and do something that I feel that is more important. His tendency was he left the NFL in order for him to join the military, and his disposition was, I'm going to be a loyal person within the military. The controversy, as we talked about before, was that there was friendly fire as opposed to fire from the enemy, and how they spun it to make him a hero as opposed to what the truth was. So that was the controversy of that. That's why we presented that as your first.
Okay. I think I get it.
Yeah, so you can kind of take Pat Tillman out of your mind in terms of the poster boy of virtue. We gave it as an example, and John McCain in his book wrote and said that this is a perfect poster boy of virtue, but not necessarily, because that's why we knew about the controversy that was involved in it.
Right.
Okay,
Okay.
are we all on the same plane? Is this making a little more sense, guys?
So,
Okay,
okay, so like using myself as an example, I guess. So like my character trait. Okay, so one of my character traits is loyalty, right? So my habit would be, for example, at a point I could go, I was working at the job I'm at now, and then I had an opportunity to go to do a work study program at the school. And it offered more money, and it was just something I wanted to do. But I ended up staying at my current position, making, the less money because of a few things. I mean, maybe some were slightly selfish and some were the benefit of, the company and not wanting to leave my boss like up in smoke type of thing.
mhm.
Um, is that kind of like, am I going on the right path here?
Yeah, so your character, if you feel that your virtuous character is loyalty, then your habits are that when there is loyalty in your life, you are going to make sure that you are loyal to come in on, that you are loyal to stay with a company. That is part of that loyalty, that you are loyal in all of the things that you do. So you're not just loyal to a company, but you're loyal to people, you're loyal to your studies, you're loyal in all of the things that you do. So your tendencies and then your disposition would be always about loyalty. So
Mhm.
that's just one of the traits of your character.
Right, just one.
Your habits, it turns into your tendencies and then your disposition. But yes, I
Okay.
believe you,
So you have to figure out what the character is in order to kind of figure out why you have your habits, tendencies, and the dispositions.
right,
So if a
exactly,
person is patient, then their habits, tendencies, and dispositions will show basically why that person is considered a um, patient virtue.
right. What makes
Okay,
you good at that? Yes, absolutely.
okay,
Very-
okay. I think I got it then.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Chris.
Good morning.
Hey,
So,
Chris.
so we were talking about, so this version of ethics, and we talked about the saints and the heroes as exemplars of human ethics. And then I said to you that Susan Wolf, which is one of those names that you have to remember, because just like with Mill and Bethan and Kant, Susan is one of these philosophers that basically is a proponent of virtue ethics. And she describes a moral saint as a person whose every action is as good as possible. That is, who is as morally worthy as can be. But Wolf goes on to argue that moral saints are not especially happy, since the demands of saintly perfection might include self-sacrifice. So remember, according to Wolf, a saint, a moral saint, would not be a happy person. They would not be happy because their saintly perfection requires self-sacrifice. So it's never about them. It's always about whom they're serving, all about what their work is compiling. And virtue ethics holds to the mindset, unlike utilitarians, unlike Kant, that tends to hold that happiness is something very different from pleasure. So happiness is not a pleasurable thing. Happiness is simply service. It's self-sacrifice. It's not about the happiness of satisfying oneself. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So as we go into this, she describes that a moral saint would not be one cruel. So you could actually cross yourself off the list. If you are a moral saint, you would not be cruel in any way. You would not be comedic in any way. You would not be cynical in any way. You would not be sarcastic in any way, nor would you be witty. A moral, rather they would are dull with no hobbies, no private lives, no personal interests. And Wolf thought it impossible to achieve. So Wolf says this is what a moral saint would be if it was possible for there to be a moral saint. But Wolf says, no, this is impossible to achieve. There cannot be a moral saint, according to Wolf. But the closest example of what could be a moral saint, what might have been Mother Teresa. So do you get what she's saying? She's saying that if you were to consider someone a moral saint, they would have to meet this criteria, that they would not be these things, that they would have to be dull, no hobbies, no private lives, no personal interest. And that's impossible, according to Susan Ruff, for a person to do, because everybody has private lives. Everyone has personal interests. A lot of people have hobbies. But she believes that a moral saint is an impossibility. But if you had a possibility, probably your closest example might be Mother Teresa. Now, Mother Teresa, according to the Catholic Church, is considered a saint. But Wolf would describe that even she would not meet that criteria, because Mother Teresa was kind of witty. She was funny, but she was sacrificial. She wasn't cruel, but she was funny. There was nothing cynical or sarcastic about her, but she was funny. So you have now Aristotle, who was born in 384 BC in Greece. And around the age of 17, he went to study at Plato's Academy in Athens. Aristotle traveled for several years, and then 2 or 3 years was the tutor to Alexander Philip's young son. Alexander Philip, the emperor, and later became known as Alexander the Great, remember? And then at 335 BC, Aristotle returned to Athens, and then he organized his own school called the Lyceum. There he taught and wrote almost until his death 13 years later. He was known only for his moral theory, but not only for his moral theory, but also for his logic, for biology, metaphysics, physics, arts, and politics. But the basic notions of his moral theory was found in the Nicomachean Ethics that he named for his son. Interesting enough, since Aristotle is considered the father of virtue ethics, we're going to look at something that will help you to see it a little bit better. So I'm going to go on and stop the recording, and I'm going to let you see this real short clip for you. Any questions while I'm getting this started? Are you all still there? Are you confused? Are you okay?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
At least I am.
still here, no questions. My brain is braining.
Okay,
Brandon. Is better. Brandon is better. Brandon is better. Please vote for Brandon Johnson for mayor.
okay. Let me go on and share this.
Random question, is Deidre, is she okay? Deidre?
Heard from Deirdre, so don't know. I haven't heard from her, but I'm going to be reaching out to all of the students this week. I hope
Okay. Yeah.
I want to make sure I can hear.
Virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is a philosophy developed by Aristotle and other ancient Greeks. It is the quest to understand and live a life of moral character. This character-based approach to morality assumes that we acquire virtue through practice. By practicing being honest, brave, just, generous, and so on, a person develops an honorable and moral character. According to Aristotle, by honing virtuous habits, people will likely make the right choice when faced with ethical challenges. To illustrate the difference among three key moral philosophies, ethicists Mark White and Robert Arp refer to the film The Dark Knight, where Batman has the opportunity to kill the Joker. Utilitarians, White and Arp suggest, would endorse killing the Joker. By taking this one life, Batman could save multitudes. Deontologists, on the other hand, would reject killing the Joker simply because it's wrong to kill. But a virtue ethicist would highlight the character of the person who kills the Joker. Does Batman want to be the kind of person who takes his enemies' lives? No. In fact, he doesn't. So, virtue ethics helps us understand what it means to be a virtuous human being. And it gives us a guide for living life without giving us specific rules for resolving ethical dilemmas.
Okay, does that?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Like, basically how we were saying, like, it, if I'm loyal, then it's like there's certain things that are gonna be shown in my life that basically show me loyalty, but it doesn't tell me how to be loyal. It basically, like, I have to show it, maybe. Is that it?
Okay, well, let me start the recording again. Hold on a second. Okay, so what we saw in the video, we saw three comparisons in terms of the different people that we've just been studying, right? And so they gave the example of the Black Knight, the Dark Knight. So I'm going to go on and maybe use another example. So unfortunately, we've had two mass shootings in the last 2 days, right? We just had the one at Michigan State. We've had the one in Texas. So I'm going to take the Michigan State. So if a person comes into a place like Michigan State or comes into any school or any corporation, what have you, and they are trying to kill a person, Utilitarians would say that that person becomes a hero who winds up shooting the mass armed person who is trying to take out all these lives. Why? Because by taking out the life, according to utilitarians, of that one person will save the masses of the other individuals that are on campus or the other individuals that are involved in where, right? However, number two, you have those who are deontological, which is Kant. Deontological ethics would say it is never good for you to kill a person. So instead of killing that person, you need to capture them so that they can be arrested and come to trial so that they can get so that people can get the justice that they need. So it would be better for that hero to actually capture them and take care of them so that they can actually stand trial. However, virtue ethics would say it is the type of person who would step up to the plate in the beginning to make sure that people are safe. Virtue ethics is what we ought to be. So whether or not it's not killing the person who is doing the shooting and protecting those who are around, that is all considered virtue. Does that make sense?
Just a question. So do virtue ethics then agree with the utilitarians? Because, you know, they're endorsing to kill the Joker, but virtue ethic, they want to highlight that person. So wouldn't that be that in the positive?
They wouldn't highlight them in killing them. They would
What was
highlight
that?
the person in protecting the people, whether or not they killed them or whether or not they protected the people, whether or not they were able to save him so that he could go to trial. They would highlight him because he had the virtue to step up to protect. It wasn't about what he did in virtue ethics, it's what he was.
Okay. Okay.
Again,
Okay.
it's that
Yeah, because you said they are, hold on. They are the what? They're saints and heroes and examples of human experience. So he would be considered like a hero.
he would be considered a hero. Yes.
Okay, okay. I got you. I'm good.
And that's why the whole Tillman situation came up, is because of the decision that he made, considered him a hero because of what he ought to be. And the whole controversy of why he died in that war became what, became reflective of whether or not he really was considered a hero or not. Because if he was there and he was friendly fired in his unit, what really happened, what was going on. But because they spun it as him being a hero, that is what made him, according to King, from what they told us he was, that he was killed by the enemy, that made him a hero, which made him a virtuous person. So when you all work at a soup kitchen and your whole disposition and habits are about helping homeless people, and it's not about what you do, but it's just your whole demeanor, your whole championship for that particular cause, or whatever the cause might be, you would be considered that person of virtue, because everything that you are doing within your being, your tendencies, your dispositions, your habits, what have you, reflects that character that's within you that says that I am a humanitarian. Did I lose you?
The humanitarian part, how you involving that one again?
Okay, remember, what I ought to be is a
Yes,
humanitarian. That's the virtue.
yes. Okay, how,
Do
okay, I got you.
is
I go back to my notes.
in my habits, in my tendencies,
Mm-hmm.
position. But virtue ethics is not concerned about what you do, what you ought to do. It's what you ought to be. And everything
Mhm.
that you ought to be reflects out in what you do, what you are, your personality, your habits, your tendencies, your disposition.
Okay,
Focused on what you ought to be. Very different than what you ought to do. Utilitarians, what you ought to do. Deontological, what you ought to do. Ethical relativism, what you ought to do. Egoism, what you ought to do. Virtue ethics, what you ought to be. We clear so far, guys?
affirmative.
Okay, I heard one person.
Yeah,
Okay, Chris? You still with us, Yasmin? I think Yasmin stepped away. You with us, Dominique?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. All right, let's move on. So, let's go back here. So, in Aristotle, he would define two basic types of virtue or excellence. Intellectual virtues are excellencies of mind, such as the ability to understand and reason and judge well. Moral virtues, on the other hand, dispose us to act well. These virtues are learned by repetition through habit. So his two basic types of virtue or excellence is, remember, intellectual virtues are excellencies of mind, such as the ability to understand and reason and judge well. Moral virtues, on the other hand, dispose us to act well. And these virtues are learned by repetition through habit. Whether or not you're trying to learn these intellectual virtues or whether or not you're trying to learn these moral virtues, these are learned through repetition through habit. What disposes you to act well, you do that through habit. What disposes you to think with the ability to reason and judge and understand well comes through repetition of habit. You don't just become a good intellectual virtue person overnight. It comes through understanding over time, reasoning over time, judging well over time, and moral virtues dispose us to act well. But we don't act well just right away. It happens over time by doing things, over and over again through repetition of habit, disposes us to act well, whatever well might be at that point. So, virtue as a mean. Aristotle's virtues are these: courage, temperance, justice, pride, and magnanimity. So first of all, Aristotle would say that one of his philosophies of virtues for us as virtue ethics, what we ought to have or what we ought to be is we ought to be courageous. We ought to have courage. That is one of the philosophies of virtue ethics, that it takes courage in order for you to have virtue. It takes courage for you to go against the grain. It takes virtue for you to, courage for you to stand up against the crowd that may go another way. And so virtue ethics, according to Aristotle, would temper in the area of courage. So that's one of the areas that you would have to look at to see. He would say that these are the pillars of virtue in virtue ethics, that you must have courage. So that would be pillar number one. And then he talks about temperance. Temperance itself. Temperance is usually abstaining from something, from in some cases from drinking or smoking or doing drugs or from getting angry. All of these things would be considered temperance. It's a strict way of abstinence. It's the moderation of self-restraint. That is temperance, and one of the philosophies and the second pillar of Aristotle's philosophy of virtue. If you are one of these virtuous people, you must have courage and you must have this temperance, this moderation, this self-restraint, this ability to abstain from things that would take you out of yourself. That would be his second pillar. So far, are we in the game together? This is
Mm,
important stuff. So I need you to listen really carefully. Any questions about this so far?
mm-mm.
Okay, then there's justice. One of the things that would be considered a big pillar of virtue under Aristotle, who, like Bruce said, is the father of virtue ethics, is justice. And one of the things that justice, of course, we talk about it a lot these days, no justice, no peace. Justice is that magistrate, is that way where we see that the balances of life are equated. Justice is brought when there is fairness. Justice is brought when there is this behavior or treatment that is concerned about peace, about respect for all people. That is the justice pillar that is important in virtue ethics. What I ought to be is courageous. What I ought to be is temperate. What I ought to be is a proponent of justice, where there is a respect for all people. Okay? Now, what throws us off with virtue number 4 is what we interpret as pride. So let me ask you, what do you all normally think about when you think about the word pride? And you all can just jump out there.
Proud?
Pride,
Uh-huh.
I like, um, hmm, it's like this feeling like you don't want to admit or something.
Okay, okay. Very good.
Yeah, I was gonna say like accountability,
Okay,
not wanting to take accountability because it's gonna make you look bad.
okay. Okay. Anyone else?
I would say like proud, like self-esteem, having pride within yourself, self-esteem.
Okay.
Um, you might take satisfaction on something.
Mhm, mhm. Well, Aristotle would say in his pillar, in talking about pride, it is not the pride that oftentimes that we talk about, which all of your examples were excellent, but pride usually in country, um, in support and those kinds of things. And so that's the type of pride that we're talking about. So it's not a pride within oneself, but a pride in, you know, our system, our country, our people. You know, that's the type of pride. It's a different pride than we normally see as a destructive type of thing. It is a honorable thing. That is one of the reasons why Tillman is touted as one of those virtues, because he had enough pride in his country to be able to leave his lucrative football career in order for him to fight the fight in for his country. It's that deep feeling of satisfaction in the achievements, in the honor of his country, that he wanted to protect it and to make sure that others protected it. It's a consciousness of dignity rather than the negative characteristics that sometimes we place to pride. Okay. And the last word, magnanimity.
I'm sorry, not to interrupt you. I just want to make sure I'm getting this right. So you would say, aside from the consciousness of dignity, it's more like the honor you have for your country.
Yeah,
Is
so
what you said?
yeah, it's a dignity.
Okay.
It's not the negative, how we say, you know, they're just too proud and, you know, so they're arrogant or they're what have you, you know, they got a lot of pride or arrogance and what have you. It's not that kind of pride. It's the dignified,
Okay.
a dignified way of respect and honor for the country, for its proponents, for its people, you know, all of those things. Yes, Tommy.
I was just randomly thinking, but I'm like, is that why the LGBTQ plus community is like, they always say like pride
Yes,
for their thing?
dignity, yes.
Okay.
Mhm. Good, good observation. And then magnanimity. Don't get lost in that word, even though that's the word that he uses. That just simply means generosity. Okay, that's just the word, means generosity. So Aristotle used the virtue magnanimity, which means generosity, that a person needs to be generous in spirit. So these are the things, these are the 5 pillars, emphasizing the 5 pillars that Aristotle would say are his virtues: courage, temperance, justice, pride, and magnanimity, which is also considered generosity. Any questions before we go on?
No,
Okay,
I'm
so
good.
I just want to reiterate back to you. So courage is being able to stand up for something. Temperance is being able to have the will to give up something like drinking, or well, to not do something like drinking, smoking,
Well,
drugs, stuff
more
like that.
than absence, it's more than abstinence, it's self-restraint.
Self-restraint.
Spring. Okay.
And then justice is getting justice. I mean, like getting people getting like what they deserve in a sense.
She said fairness, peace, and respect for all people.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Pride in like one's country,
Mm-hmm.
Or
and then
one, or one's people.
yes, and
Mhm.
then magnanimity
Magnanimity.
is generosity.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, perfect. All right,
Thanks for that, too, Dominique.
thank you.
Great, great. Yeah, that's something that you want to remember, because that is the thing that defines Aristotle's whole philosophy of what virtue ethics is, what you ought to be. And these are the pillars of what you ought to be. These things should be reflected in your ethics. So when I'm thinking as a virtuous, ethical person, I'm thinking from an courage, from a courageous point of view, because sometimes that goes against the grain of everything else that people are thinking out here. I have to have temperance and self-respect, because temperance allows me to self-restrain when sometimes people are coming against you in ideas and what have you. Justice is a respect for all people. Pride is that area where we're going to be respecting of our country or our people, or what we believe in. And the magnanimity is that generosity of spirit that helps us to be the things that consider virtue. So he is the one who is defining these things as the key points of virtue. If a person is virtuous, if a person has virtue ethics, these are the key pillars that are going to reflect in their thinking and how they look at things morally at this point. And these are the tests that they're going to go by to see how we're going to look at laws, how we're going to look at controversial topics. If you're a virtual ethicist, you're going to look at these pillars as the most important things to consider. All right, so let's look at,
5 words you pronounce wrong 2 years before.
here. I'm going to stop our recording real quick. But that is all a part of that repetition that comes with that, is that when we deal with this repetition that we have learned, we've learned it by habit, we've learned it by time, sometimes through the people that we've been a part of in our lives that have taught us this. So here we go. Bonus question, guys. Bonus question, giving you a chance. Bonus question. All right. This is bonus Kant theory. So we're going back to last week. Kant asked us to consider what is morally permissible for me to make a lying or false promise in order to extradite myself from some difficulty. So I could say something, basically a lie, or I could falsely promise something in order for me to get out of some kind of trouble, right? If I consider the maxim, remember the maxim is that test that Kant has, where whenever I'm in a difficulty that I can get it out of only by making a lie or a false promise, I would do so. Remember, the maxim is something that it has to be a test that everyone can do, right? To know whether or not this is morally acceptable, it must pass the test of that categorical imperative. You all remember categorical imperative, right? So, would lying to prospective research subjects fail or pass the test of the imperative, categorical imperative? If I decided to, like with the Tuskegee experiment and those 390 men who did not understand why they were there, they were illiterate and they were poor, and we promised them that they were going to get 3 squares and they were going to get medical help and they were going to get all this other stuff. And they just thought that that was the best thing for their lives, but they didn't understand all of those things. Therefore, would Kant believe it is permissible to lie based upon the categorical imperative? So, would Kant believe that it's permissible to lie, A, when it's necessary? Would he believe that it's permissible to lie never? Or does he believe that it's permissible to lie always? Go on and put it in the chat direct to me, your answer, A, B, or C, based upon the categorical imperative. This is really important because you guys are going to see this again, maybe on the midterm. Take your time. I'm gonna give you guys 2 minutes. And I'm gonna pause this recording.